Men do not receive the truth from their enemies, and their friends scarcely offer it to them. That is why I have spoken it, Tocqueville says, page 170. I thought that many men would take care of announcing the new goods which equality promised to men, but the few would dare point out the perils with which it threatens them from afar. It is therefore principally toward these perils that I have directed my attention, and believing I saw them clearly, I have not had the cowardice to be silent about them. So Tocqueville wrote in the preface to Volume 2 of Democracy in America, which we'll turn to for the rest of the class. What a statement, though, right? Your enemies don't tell you the truth. They want to deceive you. It is only friends who tell the truth. And so it is with Tocqueville, speaking the hard truths about the dangers of democracy to an audience who may not be willing to hear it. He's kind of said that before in Volume 1. What's been the big picture so far in this book that we've looked at? By the way, that was Appalachian Spring, the opening song from Aaron Copland, famous American composer who's well known for writing songs largely inspired by Tocqueville. But yeah, let's consider the big picture of the book so far and summary of Volume 1 as we turn now to Volume 2. We started with, well, again, what's his general purpose, like we said? It's to train democracy, realizing that democracy is just inevitable. This rise of individual rights and self-government and voting, but also a broader way of life and a tendency of the majority to rule everything. All these things he's talked about. It's coming everywhere. It's going to cover the world soon, or at least something like it, right? So how do you prepare the world to receive it well? How do we train democracy and not let it fall into its worst vices? How do we pull it out of that and teach it its best virtues? He talks about the origins, and that's, of course, the Puritans and their unique contribution to the real founding, as he said. And really, they're the ones who made everything possible that we saw in the Revolution and all that. And they're the ones who reconciled the spirit of liberty with the spirit of religion. I have a lot more to say about religion in Volume 2, as we'll see. Once that's set in motion, origins, next comes the development. How do things grow into what they are? And he talks about inheritance laws in the early American Republic that require estates to be divided up among children receiving from their fathers. So no longer will land and estates pass from one son or one father to the oldest son again and again. And he also mentions how this culminates in a new kind of sovereignty of the people over everything and how all institutions are designed around that we the people statement, which the Constitution formalizes, but it was there even before the Constitution, he insists. But then he considers the dangers to all of that. He spends some time talking about how sovereignty of the people can corrupt the people, right? I mean, if power corrupts, as we often say, we usually think of that in terms of politicians, but is it just as true of multitudes? Tocqueville says yes. Tyranny of the majority is really striking. And it's not just tyranny over, majority vote, as we said earlier in the class. It's more tyranny over thought, which is especially troubling, and the tendency of Americans to just conform. And he says this is the single greatest danger that Americans face, and it's kind of the root of all their other dangers. And he'll come back to it again and again in Volume 2. But good news is there are checks on that, he says. And he spends chapter 7 was on the danger of tyranny of the majority. Chapter 8 was on the checks. And he focuses on decentralized administration, as he calls it, meaning that the way government governs is divided up between national powers, which deal with only a few things in the national interest, like defense and commerce, and a huge multitude of state governments, and within those, city governments, and town halls, and school boards, and universities, and, just this vast array of little subdivisions of government. And as a result, that checks the tyranny of the majority because majoritarian influence only goes so far. It can never really make it to the top. It can never really influence Congress. If it does, it's got one institution made to catch it. And of course, that's the House of Representatives. But then he also talks about lawyers and jury trials and how important they are. And the fact that as powerful as tyranny of the majority is and as wild as it can be, it still respects the rule of law. And he says that's a miracle that that happens. But all the while, the question is lingering, why? Well, he answers it in the end, right? It's because of mores. It's because of deep social habits and habits of the heart, right? But it's getting there. But yeah, it talks about maintaining democracy. Good laws, yes, the Constitution, state constitutions, and just the legal tradition in the United States that was largely copied from Britain, but then improved on in all kinds of uniquely American ways. But it's really, he says, good mores and the habits of the heart, like we said, that allow people to be free in themselves, and that enables them to be free politically. And then he talks about religion, which isn't so much a source of mores, but it does really reinforce the mores that are already there. And he has a lot to say about religion and its interaction with politics, its indirect influence, the fact that religion is so vibrant in the United States, specifically because we have no established church, no established religion, not at the federal level and not at the state level. Remember, the last state to disestablish was Massachusetts in 1833, and that was it. So that's it. The danger of tyranny of the majority is great, but Americans have all these things that check it and limit it. Modesty, he considers the questions in chapter 10 of volume 2, or sorry, part 2, on will America last? The great dangerous tyranny of the majority, and probably the most insidious tyranny of the majority, is over Native Americans and blacks, whether slave or free. And that's where it gets particularly toxic and dangerous. It's one thing to, tyrannize over the thought of individuals, but what about whole groups of people horribly treated and discriminated against? And then, all that said, he divides up the groups. He talks about the situation of enslaved blacks versus free blacks. And free blacks have a unique set of burdens all their own that in some ways are almost worse than what slaves live with. He talks about the distance between the North and the South when it comes to Anglo-Americans. The predominant, majority white population is actually very different in the North as it is in the South. All that adds up to what he sees as the possibility of a major conflict in the United States, a civil war. So he called it. So the two major threats are, of course, slave revolts, like happened with Nat Turner, or North and South divide along these very narrow lines and different ways of life. And then he ends that chapter. I didn't go into it in detail, but just the commercial energy of the United States. And I kind of skipped over it because we'll come back to it later in the book. So there's the big picture, just kind of a 30,000-foot view of what we've seen in volume 1. A lot of this is, like I said, very top down, and about broad institutions and trends and this and that. Volume 2 of Democracy in America, he instead shifts his focus to more particular, to smaller things. And if you flip through the chapters, you can see how he does that. Each one kind of deals with a very particular aspect of Americans, beginning with, on page 170, how Americans think. And he's generalizing here, of course, but in general, what is the philosophic method of the Americans? And what is it? Well, what is it back in the old world? When we say Western philosophy in general, what do you think of? Plato, Aristotle, right? And the whole gang through the ages all the way up to the 20th century, and Martin Heidegger and Sigmund Freud and all these great, great minds, right? And it's a big, long, complicated history with all kinds of ideas. And it's all derived, of course, from books, books, books. How so much of Western civilization it comes from just volumes of writings of philosophers trying to persuade. What does this mean in America? He says, great opening line. I think that there is not in the civilized world a country where philosophy is paid less attention to than in the United States. The Americans have no philosophic school, which is their own, at least not yet, and they pay very little mind to those who divide Europe. There's big disputes in Europe, right? Things that people will fight about, in Parisian cafes and stuff like that. In America, it's kind of like, meh, what does that matter? Who cares? Most Americans scarcely know the philosophers' names, right? Who is George Hegel to anyone, right? Who is Soren Kierkegaard? Now, of course, if you go to college these days, you encounter these guys more, as we know. But, your average American out there, right? It's only people who are into philosophy who care. Most people don't care. Totally different in Europe. People will banter about philosophic ideas over here and over there, and it really matters, right? Not in America, though. Nevertheless, he says, it is easy to see that almost all the inhabitants of the United States govern their minds in the same manner, and they direct them according to the same rules. So even though we don't have a philosophic school, there's no uniquely American philosophy. There is, he says, a philosophic method, like a how to sort of thing. Not a theory, right? But a method. What is it? He describes it on 171. Avoiding the spirit of system, right? Scholasticism, the scientific, progressive sort of method of developing knowledge, all these methods that are popular in Western philosophy, the Platonic dialogue, whatever. No, what we don't have a spirit of system at all, or the yoke of habit, or the maxims of family for that matter, the opinions of class, and up to a certain point, national prejudices. Second, taking tradition only as a piece of information and present facts only as useful preparatory work for doing differently and better. Seeking the reason for things, and he'll make a big deal out of this, doing it by oneself and in oneself alone. Aiming for the result without allowing oneself to be shackled by the means. Right? There's a big one. Whatever philosophy gets you to where you want to go is the true philosophy, right? It's all about means, a proportion to ends. Setting one's sights on the substance beneath the form. Such are the principal traits that characterize what I will call the philosophic method of the Americans. I'll go still further. And among these diverse traits, I look for the principal one. And the one that can summarize almost all the others, I find that in most of the operations of the mind, each American appeals only to the individual effort of his own reason. And that's very important. We are all about individual insight. We trust ourselves very much. Now, that, he points out, is not totally foreign to Western philosophy. And in fact, there's one philosopher in particular who made his whole philosophic system based on that, your individual self. I think, therefore I am, said Rene Descartes. And it's amazing if you read Descartes, you start very much with this individual insight, and then you work your way upward toward reconstructing all of reality. So he says Americans are Cartesian. They've never read Descartes. They probably don't even know who he is, but they think in terms of his teaching by chance, it seems. So, why is this? What is it about democracy that makes it this way? In the midst of the continental movement which prevails within democratic society, the tie which unites generations with each other is loosened or broken. Right? We don't have much of a tradition in America. And so, for that reason, we don't have much of a tradition to rebel against philosophically or to question philosophically. Right? All this European stuff, right, in so many ways is kind of going against the system, but somehow in America, it's not like that. He says the men who live in such societies can no longer draw their beliefs from the opinions of the classes to which they belong because there are no longer any classes. There's no aristocracy, there's no serfs. And so, as a result, everybody's an individual instead of part of a group, or whatever groups we have, we form spontaneously. He'll talk about that later. And so, what does this mean for philosophy? We have no memory. There's no tradition to summon to make sense of the present. Whatever tradition or history or story we have is kind of theoretical, not really relevant, right? We want relevance. At the same time, we are all about this intense equality. As for the influence that intellect of one man may have on that of another, it is necessarily very limited in a country where the citizens have become most alike and they see each other from very close up, not perceiving the signs of an indisputable grandeur and superiority of anyone among them. They don't look up to anyone. They're all equal, right? They are continually led back toward their own reason as toward the most visible and nearest wellspring of truth, right? That distrust of authority. He'll get back to that. We always start with ourselves. We're all about thinking for ourselves, right? So we look totally within ourselves. I think, therefore I am, is the first and fundamental maxim. Then it is not only the confidence in any particular man that is destroyed, he says, but the disposition to believe any man whatsoever on the basis of his word. For that reason, each one, therefore, closes up narrowly within himself and claims to judge the world from there. So, again, this is all totally foreign from this old world stuff, isn't it? So, what a departure it is. So, what is the American philosophic method like then? He lists some features. Is it concerned with lofty theoretical ideas? No, it's concerned with how to do things. It's more machine-like, right? In the sense that it's about outcomes, as he said earlier. It's about the method that gets you to where you're going. It's about the philosophy that rationalizes what you're already doing. And for that reason, it is distinctly non-contemplative, right? It's practical, as he said. Over in Europe, it's contemplative. It's all about contemplation, that classical notion of leisure and stillness, right? Americans, though, no, it's not contemplative because it's out to get you what you want. It's out to justify and rationalize what you're already doing, like we said. You can kind of see this if you consider like what college major employers want. A survey according to National Center for Education Statistics, most of them want someone with a business and accounting degree, right, by 81.3%. Engineering comes in a close second, 75.9%. Computer science in high demand, 64. Down, down, down you go. Philosophy is not even on here. I'm assuming it's grouped with humanities, 11.6%. I'm surprised agriculture and education are lower, but then again, there's a more specific demand for those professions. But in general, the most numbers of employers, you could say, are interested in the ones at the top. Nobody wants the philosophers, it seems, or very few anyway, to the tune of 11.6%. College majors, though. Sorry, the print's a little small, but what's really in demand? What do people make when they graduate with certain degrees? Agriculture and engineering, right at the top. Computer, statistics, and mathematics. Healthcare, of course, and then business, social sciences, political science among it, physical sciences, down, down, down you go. What do philosophers make? I always remember my very blue collar uncle who drove trucks his whole life. When I declared my philosophy major in college, he said, "So you're gonna find a job in the philosophy factory, right?" So he's very great sense of humor, but yeah, that's it. The fact that we are not really keen on the theoretical stuff of philosophy, and if it exists at all, its whole purpose is, like we said, to justify what we're doing, to justify what we want, to rationalize American democracy, to provide bioethical arguments for whatever the biotech company is doing. And a lot of biotech companies actually hire philosophers for that reason, more often called ethicists. So, what does this do to us? As he pointed out, we're very much about the individualist perspective on things. We're very, like you said, Cartesian. We trust only ourselves. We tend to be very suspicious of anything outside of ourselves, any formal authority, any thoughts that were thought before us. I mean, really, what does Plato matter in contrast with my own philosophic experience? Every job application you fill out, right? They ask, what is your philosophy of business or healthcare or whatever it is you're going into? Whatever career path you've chosen, you should develop your philosophy of it. That word philosophy is most of the time attributed to an individual interpretation of things, why you're doing this, whatever. Never is it really about a school of philosophy, a world of philosophy. This explains a lot about, too, we get to sources of belief here in a minute, but the fact that we're really big on individual narrative, right? I mean, what more do I need? What more proof does anyone else need other than I saw what I saw? Right? And how do we explain? How do we support what we believe happened or what I thought I saw or whatever, whether it's supernatural or abnormal or a conspiracy or whatever? Well, all I need is just my own personal narrative, right? And that seems to be it. He points out, too, this strong tendency on page 172, and this is also really important, to only accept ideas that are clear and simple, realist in a way, with no obstructions or nuances. Hard ideas are hard. I mean, you have to really bend your mind to get them. But Americans don't have patience for that, right? So they like things cut and dry and simple. He says in 172, as they see that they succeed in resolving without help all the little difficulties that their practical life presents, they easily conclude from it that everything in the world is explicable and that nothing in it is beyond the limits of the intelligence, right? There's no mysteries. It's all totally explicable. It's all something human minds can wrap around, especially mine, right? Especially yours. Every individual has total access to the highest and loftiest things. It's very literalist in that way, very realist. In this way, they readily deny that they can't deny what they cannot understand. And this gives them little faith in the extraordinary and an almost invincible aversion to the supernatural. Now, as we'll see, the supernatural comes back, but it's only understood in a democratic way. We'll talk about that with religion here in a minute. Since they are accustomed to relying on the evidence of their own perceptions, he says, they like to see very clearly the object that they are concerned with. They therefore rid it as much as they can of its covering, like to rip the wrapper off, right? And get to the core of the thing. No obstructions, no veils, They take away everything that separates them from it and remove everything that conceals it from their view in order to see it at closer range and in the light of day. This disposition of their mind soon leads them to have contempt for forms. What does that mean? They don't like formalism. They don't like outer representations of deeper realities. They like it just clear and obvious and simple, right? Which forms which they consider as useless and inconvenient veils placed between themselves and the truth. He'll say more about formalism here in a second. But wow, what is that true of us? We just have no patience for abstract notions and difficult concepts. If something is right, is right. If something is wrong, it's wrong. Period. Right? This very rigid, very simplistic approach to questions of truth, to questions of morality. I think a great example is the McGuffey's Eclectic Readers, as they were called, these children's books that were very popular, really right up until like the mid 20th century, I believe. They were printed many, many times. But it's funny if you flip through them, you can pull them up online and read them. They always have these little morality lessons for kids, and they're so straightforward. There's no complexity, there's no nuance, there's no prudence. There's just the fact that the little boy who works hard succeeds in life, and the one who's lazy does not. Which in general is true, but aren't there complexities beyond that? Not for Americans. And so the McGuffey's readers were well known for this very clear, simple way of presenting little moral lessons to children. So, what is the other major factor? He digresses page 172, 173, but then he comes back again to the list. What is another major factor in shaping the philosophic method? There is one bedrock, there is one source of truth and belief that nobody questions. All philosophy, whatever happens in America philosophically, is made to fit with Christianity. But be specific, he means democratic Christianity, which he'll talk about in a subsequent chapter. But yeah, the sense that all philosophic notions have to be reconciled with the Bible. And if they can't be, they got to be rejected. That's a very prominent attitude. I distinctly remember being a philosophy major at a Christian university when I was younger, and that's how it was. I mean, no matter what we were studying, it's like, okay, well, what does the Bible say about this, right? Which isn't a bad question, but the point was to show, like, look, if it doesn't fit with Scripture or a specific verse anyway, then it's just nonsense. There's no reason to consider it at all. That's a very American way of doing it, Tocqueville says. So yeah, what role does religion play in philosophy, and does it hinder philosophy? I mean, is it sort of like, are you doing philosophy in a small box when you should be out in the open? That's certainly what religious skeptics would say. But what does he say? It is religion which gives birth to Anglo-American societies. One must never forget this, for the reasons he talked about before. In the United States, religion is therefore mixed together with all the national habits and all the sentiments that the fatherland brings into being. This gives it a special force. To that powerful reason, add this other, equally powerful one. In America, religion has, so to speak, set limits for itself on its own. And he's mentioned this before, the fact that religion puts the brakes on human progress, not because progress is bad, it's just that it can go in directions that are kind of aimless and scary and risky. So too with philosophy. Christianity has thus conserved a great influence over the minds of the Americans. And what I want above all to remark is that it prevails not only as a philosophy that is adopted after examination, but as a religion that is believed without debate. In the United States, the Christian sects, all those denominations are infinite variety. But like you said before, they all have a sort of moral consensus. And that consensus gives you the framework, the groundwork for doing philosophy. And no one seems to doubt that. The other major factor, the last one, is the fact that we are, when we do philosophy at all in America, again, it's a method, right? It's not yet a theory, but we're doing it in a land that's very new. Look at those old founders, and they seem very ancient, but still, I mean, 150 some odd years ago, that's like a blip in world history. uh, Go back to the old world, and people talk about things that happened, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, over 1,000 years ago, like it was yesterday, right? In America, though, we don't quite have that long ancient tradition. And so as a result, philosophy doesn't have as much, again, to rebel against, he says. Now, all that said, this is a method, right? It's a how-to kind of philosophy. But is it possible, he entertains the thought, that maybe a new kind of philosophy will emerge out of it? But let's think about this for a second. When is philosophy at its best? This isn't from the book, just our own question. Is it when, like Socrates did, it challenges the dogmatic beliefs specifically of politics, or most dangerous of all, of democratic politics like Socrates did and went to his death because of it, to call into question the most sacred shared assumptions of a democratic community? That's very, very dangerous because they'll come after you. Yeah, you'll get ostracized, you'll get punished, but if you push hard enough like Socrates did, it turns fatal. But still, that's what philosophy has to do. In a sense, Socrates had to die, right? In order to become the founder of Western philosophy, and to always call into question the political order as it's given to us. Modern philosophy culminates much more in not questioning the political order, but becoming the political order. Should a single philosophy be turned into that order? If you follow that path, you end up with fascism. That's Benito Mussolini, where there's only one philosophy in town. It becomes a political party that seizes the government and squelches everything else. Is that it? What seems to happen in democratic times, as Tocqueville is describing it, is that philosophy is much more about your own individual preference, right? Nietzsche, Descartes, Socrates, what's the difference? It's all about which one you like. It's all up to you to go with whatever fits your taste and your personal style. You take that, survey of philosophy class and you read some of this and some of that, and you pick your favorite. What does this do to philosophy, though? Can philosophy be dangerous anymore like it was for Socrates? No, it seems like either it becomes a rigid system of fascism or it just kind of becomes nothing. It becomes equal with every other field of study. It's just whatever you choose to major in, right? And if you choose philosophy, well, that choice is equal to majoring in basket weaving or whatever else. It's all just up to you. Is it really? Isn't philosophy somehow higher and nobler and better than everything else? Speaking of the basket weaving major, we don't have one at UMary, but suppose you chose that major. Okay, why? What reason can you give, which is itself not a philosophic statement? And if so, doesn't that prove that philosophy really is kind of superior? What have we done to it, though, when we just make it all up to individual choice and individual aspiration? But what about American philosophy? Tocqueville says at the end, maybe there will be a uniquely philosophic way of doing things that grows out of all this. Well, so far, when he was writing anyway, we hadn't really seen Americans capable of doing this. There were some brilliant American philosophic minds: Ben Franklin, Jonathan Edwards, and of course, Thomas Jefferson. But in a lot of ways, they just kind of copied European ways of thinking. Jefferson, I think, came closest to breaking out of that. But even he was just largely beholden to 18th century continental thought. What happens, though? We do develop a school of philosophy known as pragmatism, which fits exactly what Tocqueville's describing, right? We want ideas to be useful. Why is something true, says the pragmatist? Not because it's true in itself in some abstract way and your mind seizes on it and discovers it. No, it's true because it works for you. It's useful. The major founder of this school of thought was William James. Major proponent 20th century was John Dewey. And more recently, Richard Rorty is an overt pragmatist. And Rorty explains his pragmatism in a way that really fits with what Tocqueville is describing. If you pick up his book, I've had the joy of teaching it. Contingency, Irony, Solidarity. It's about the funniest cover of a philosophic book I've ever seen, with Rorty just sitting in his backyard. But he says at one point, look, here it is. To realize the contingency, or you might say the relativity, of one's convictions, and yet stand for them unflinchingly. That is what distinguishes a civilized man from a barbarian. What does that mean? A barbarian is someone who really thinks that his deep convictions and his cause are actually true. A civilized man recognizes that they are not true, but he stands for them unflinchingly. Rorty himself was a very liberal guy. He was all in support of government programs for poverty and social justice and social change and all this kind of stuff and protest culture. But he'd write philosophically and say, look, my fellow progressives misunderstand, right? That their ideas, that their convictions are not actually true. They shouldn't think that. They should accept that there's no reason that we fight for, equal rights for whoever, for, social justice. No, those things don't square with anything in reality. It's just what we believe, right? And presumably, if I believe something different tomorrow, then that will be true. And Rory seemed perfectly fine with that. So it's a maddening book if you read it, but it's still an interesting insight into the way Americans go about this. And you really see kind of that philosophy of pragmatism in full blossom with this, as Tocqueville describes it. So yeah, where does this leave us? Is American philosophy any good? Does it have the same rigor and the same value to the human mind as continental philosophy? Well, what do Americans tend to believe? What are our sources of belief, whether religious or moral or whatever, variety of types of belief, but what are the sources? Well, Tocqueville starts off very broadly and says, look, we've always got some kind of dogmatic belief on page 175. And that's a great observation. Societies and individuals alike can't exist, can't flourish, can't function without some kind of unquestioned dogmatic belief, whatever it may be, right? And it varies from society to society. It might vary from individual to individual. But, no matter how brilliant you think you are, even the greatest philosopher, he says, bottom of 175, still goes day to day with all kinds of things that he never questions. There is no philosopher in the world so great, he says, that he does not believe a million things on the word of others, and who does not assume many more truths that he has proven. This is not only necessary, but desirable. This is a good thing, Tocqueville says. A man who would undertake to examine everything by himself would be able to give only a little time and attention to each thing. This labor would keep his mind in perpetual agitation and prevent him from penetrating deeply into the truth and fixing himself solidly on any certitude. His mind would be at the same time independent and weak. It is necessary, then, he says, 176, among the diverse objects of human opinions, that he make a choice and that he adopt many beliefs without debate in order to delve more deeply into a smaller number of them that he has reserved for examination. It is true that any man who accepts an opinion on the word of others puts his mind into servitude, sure, but it is a salutary servitude that allows him to make good use of liberty. You've got to believe something, and it has to be something that you didn't come up with, right? It's only by that you use it's only by accepting that you're able to come up with anything else. You must start with the things that you can't not know, right? That it's impossible to not know. What are those first truths? If you read classic metaphysics and Aristotle, this is his major obsession, right? What is the first truth that makes all other knowledge possible, right? For that reason, Tocqueville says, we always settle on some kind of authority. It is therefore always necessary, no matter what the circumstances are, that authority exists somewhere, right? It's not a question of will you have an authority or not. No, it's a question of what that authority will be. So that's all very lofty stuff. But I hope the general point is clear. You've got to plant your mind somewhere, right? You've got to rest in the knowledge of something with certainty. Okay, so what does this mean to democratic times, and what do we tend to do in the face of authority? We're very doubtful about it. We're very skeptical about it. And so in aristocratic times, it wasn't a problem because authority was clearly established. The honor of the nobles, the teachings of the church, done. But we're not in aristocratic times anymore. And he says, to the extent that citizens become more equal and more alike, 176 at the bottom, the inclination of each is to believe blindly a certain man or certain, or sorry, uh, yeah, the inclination of each is to believe blindly a certain man or certain class diminishes. The tendency to believe the mass increases, and it is opinion which increasingly leads the world. So who's the authority nowadays? Once again, that looming tyranny of the majority is what he's talking about. He doesn't call it that here, but you can tell that's what he means. We like mass opinion. So it's funny to think we don't like formal authority. And I think this is embodied best in that trope you've heard, spiritual but not religious. I'm trying to imagine what a spiritual but not religious wedding would look like. Who knows? But um, the fact that we like the idea of being spiritual very much, but not in any kind of formal religious tradition. No, we put much more trust in common opinion. We're much more prone to look to that. Now, you say, hold on a second. Didn't he just say we're very individualistic? Indeed, we are. And here you have the central paradox that Tocqueville grapples with, though in a way it's not actually a paradox. Individual conscience in personal philosophy, we say is our source of belief, but we also tend to have the content of that personal belief very much shaped by people around us. Popular opinion, tyranny of the majority is always lurking. We say we think for ourselves, and yet if you listen to what we actually think, it's not much different from what everybody else thinks. So what's happening here? I couldn't resist this picture of Oprah meditating with a group of people. It's all individual, and yet we're all doing the same thing. I think too of the I couldn't find the image, but the original iPod ads before the smartphone came out, and Apple in general, right? They advertise their products like, think different. Have you seen those ads? Everybody's an individual, right? And yet everybody owns an Apple device. What's going on here? It's a weird paradox, and yet it sort of makes sense that the more individual we are, the more we tend to go along with the group. Why is that? The same equality, 177, which renders him independent of each of his fellow citizens individually, abandons him, isolated and without defense to the influence of the greatest number. Okay, I'm going to be an individual. I'm going to think for myself. And pretty soon, I don't know what I think. I don't know what to root my ideas in. What comes along to answer that question for me? the people I'm around. Groupthink, tyranny of the majority. The public thus has among democratic peoples a remarkable power of which aristocratic nations could not even conceive the idea. It does not persuade men of its beliefs. It imposes them and makes them penetrate the souls of men by a sort of immense pressure of the mind and the intellect of each. In the United States, the majority takes care to supply individuals with a host of ready-made opinions and tropes and mantras and social media memes and whatever, and thus relieves them of the obligation of forming their own. I think for myself, and yet I think whatever the group thinks. It just goes around and around. There are a great number of theories of philosophy, morality, or politics which everyone there adopts in their way without examination, on the word of the public. And if one looks closely, one will see that religion itself prevails there much less as revealed doctrine than as common opinion. And he'll get to that in a later chapter, but what an amazing claim. Is it possible that so much of what we believe about morality, about faith, isn't really because we've concluded that it's true, but it's more because the people around us think the same way? I mean, why do you hold the convictions that you do about society, politics, and human dignity and whatever? Is it because you're convinced philosophically as an individual? Or is it because that's just kind of what everybody else thinks and you want to be part of the group and so you go along? Sure enough, tyranny of the majority is very powerful in that way, like we said before. He says, I see these two tendencies on page 178 going in opposite directions, right? Inequality. One carries the mind of each man to new thoughts, and the other readily reduces it to no longer thinking at all. I mean, are you even thinking, right, anymore if it's just groupthink all the way? And I see how, under the influence of certain laws, democracy may extinguish the intellectual liberty that the democratic social state favors, so that after having broken all the shackles once imposed upon it by classes and by individual men, the human mind would shackle itself tightly to the general will of the majority. And there it is. Tyranny of the majority is what wins. But I mean, why don't we start off just being individual and stay individual? Why don't we just be like Socrates and purely focused on the good of the individual soul and never submit to the popular will? Well, maybe it's because we're political by nature, as Aristotle taught. And maybe this kind of groupthink isn't such a bad thing. So let's not kid ourselves that we're radical individuals anymore. At the same time, let's see the value of tempering the tyranny of the majority. What's the middle ground here? Well, what does this mean for religion? He comes back to religion again and again. And he had a lot to say about it in the end of volume one. But yeah, here he comes back to it in greater detail and kind of considers religion considered in itself. He restates what he said before, right? It's impossible to not have a settled dogma. It's impossible to not have a set of beliefs that you never question. You just do it by being human. You do it out of just sort of an innate habit. Individuals always assume some kind of fixed truth, whatever that may be. So too to societies. Um, Philosophy alone can't take you there, he says on page 179, and that's a very classic teaching. He also says, though, that there's something in our nature that needs it as communities, too. So maybe there are those rare individuals who can kind of jettison religious truth and come up with their own individual ideas about how to live, but societies can't do that. It's kind of a classic philosophy 101 question, right? Can you be moral without God? Right? Um, Individually, maybe. Collectively, no way. Right? That's something George Washington saw very well. We'll get back to him. But yeah, there's a deep human need for this kind of transcendent truth about our relations with each other, about who God is, and you can never get away with it, right? He states that again, like he did in the previous chapter. What's it for, though? What does religion do? Christianity specifically, he says, for Americans and for democracy. It has everything to do with showing us human happiness. Happiness not just in the next world, in the hereafter, but also in here, in this world. He says, 180. A little ways from the top. When religion is destroyed among a people, doubt takes over the highest regions of the intellect, and in a halfway paralyzes all the others. Everyone becomes used to having only confused and unstable notions about matters that most interest his fellow men and himself. Men defer their opinions badly, or they abandon them. And since they despair of being able by themselves alone to resolve the greatest problems that human fate presents, they are reduced in a cowardly fashion to not giving them any thought. Really, what happens is it prepares citizens for servitude, he says in that next little paragraph. In order to be free, one must believe, because it's all about the goal of the political community, which is happiness. Aristotle obviously didn't take it all the way. His understanding of happiness was more bound by the world. But Christianity comes along and builds on Aristotle's ideas, kind of understands happiness in an eternal sense, but that makes the most sense of the world in which we're in now. Right? That was kind of Augustine's point that we looked at a few classes ago. What's the other thing it does? It's a source of virtue necessary for freedom. Or you might say, much like the mores, it perfects the virtues that are there. And then, of course, it adds the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. Uh, yeah, as he says, everything is in motion in a democratic society, in the intellectual world, and they wish at least that everything be firm and stable in a material order. And since they are no longer able to recover their former beliefs, they give themselves a master. We looked previously at those posters from like Soviet Russia, where Joseph Stalin really does look a bit godlike. What does this tell you? That we make up a kind of pseudo religion of totalitarianism if we get rid of the old religion. For myself, Tocqueville says, I doubt that man can ever support at the same time complete religious independence and complete political liberty. And I am led to think that if he has no faith, then he must serve. And if he is free, he must believe. Religion is critical for a vibrant liberty. That's exactly what George Washington said again back in the farewell address, right? Don't think for a moment that you can maintain any kind of freedom without religion and its vital role in civil society. So there's what it does. But what are the dangers? And this is something you'll see Tocqueville do again and again in volume 2. Here's the thing, here's the democratic situation, here's the danger. But then here's how Americans cope with it, right? So just like tyranny of the majority, so too religion is in kind of a perilous situation. What are its dangers? One is the fact, he says on the bottom of page 180, that it can slip into kind of a radical individual spirituality or personal inspiration. Back to that individualism. That it's all about this isolation of each one from another and leading each to become concerned with himself alone and try to understand his whole religious framework within that context. It opens their soul exclusively to the love of material pleasures, another point he'll get back to. So, why is religious individualism so dangerous? Because it doesn't derive its source from any kind of shared revelation or shared experience. It's all about you, you, you. And if it's that, then what is it? What's funny is there was a whole sort of religious philosophical school in America known as the Transcendentalists. And that's basically what they believed, that what is real religion in the end? It's not looking outward to teachings or traditions or spiritual disciplines or anything like that. It's looking inward. It's finding God inside yourself. So they taught. There's some very famous American writers who are transcendentalists. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry David Thoreau, Herman Melville, and many, many others. And they really took this teaching to heart that all revealed religion was basically in the way of you discovering the God within. The guy who was the major figure was Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he wrote, the purpose of life seems to be to acquaint man with God or with nature or reality. No, with himself. He is not to live the future as described to him, but to live the real future to the real present. The highest revelation is that of God in every man, right? Not outside of you, not to be pursued and understood, not to be, accepted through sacraments, but to just be found within, right? Now, Tocqueville backs off and he spends several pages discussing this. We won't go through it in detail. This isn't totally foreign to Christianity. I mean, consider St. Augustine, and you've read the Confessions in another class, the first ever autobiography in Western history, right? Except for, of course, Julius Caesar's memoirs. Um, but it was all about this notion of the individual soul's journey to God, as told by St. Augustine. So, yeah, there's something about that individualism that does grow out of traditional Christianity. But notice, it was the soul's journey to God. It was from within the church and its teachings, which Augustine was a bishop of, right? It wasn't just like wandering into the woods and, discovering that you are, in fact, a God, right? So, dangers, radical individualism. What else? The possibility that democracy can overtake religious transcendence, that what we see as religious experience and the transcendence involved and the contact with the divine becomes more and more defined by democratic ideas and society's needs and stuff like that. I remember one very progressive pastor in Los Angeles speaking, and he said something like, we should regard social justice as a sacrament, right? There you go. It's very earthbound. It's very worldly in that way. Consider church architecture. Anyone seen Our Lady of Angels in Los Angeles, right off the 405 freeway? Would you describe it as beautiful? I'll just throw it out there. Whatever it is definitely made to fit with the times. The diocese chose an architect who designed a church made to look like what was hip and fashionable in the mid 2000s when it was built. Is it transcendent, or is it a product of the surrounding democratic culture? Where does the transcendence go in such a thing? It's a different church on the inside. Sorry, there are two different churches. But yeah, I mean, it looks like a just very minimalist. It's not clear like what the focus of attention is. The cross is very prominent, but it doesn't really look like the cross. The bottom is shorter than the top. Why? What's going on here? I think it was Rod Dreyer, if I remember right, wrote a book years ago. The title was "Ugly as Sin." There was a book about ugly church architecture and the architects who designed them, who themselves were not Christians at all. They were just asked by the board of elders and whoever, the endowment, to build churches that would be fashionable and hip without really any consideration of did they really put you in contact with something transcendent, or did they just cater to popular tastes? He also mentions the tendency of Americans on page 183, and he mentioned this before, to dislike formalism. They don't like things being formal. Informality is so much more appealing. And this would have been something common in Tocqueville's day during, like we said, that Second Great Awakening. Who were the major figures in that movement? Popular country preachers. Again, just average guys, right, who didn't have any formal theological training. They weren't prepared to be ministers or anything. They just got a word from God and they hopped up on a platform with their Bible and started preaching, and they were pretty good at it. Well, what did this mean for the formal preachers? People like Ezra Stiles at Yale College, who was deeply alarmed at this Second Great Awakening stuff. And the First Great Awakening had kind of the same reception, right? Who does this guy think he is, standing there preaching all this? He's not a formal trained minister, but this is what prevails in America. We like informalism. We tend to prefer things to not be formal. And who ended up prevailing in American spirituality? The trained minister? No, the country preacher. And this lasts a very long time, well into the 20th century. Popular preachers like Billy Sunday, known for punching his Bible on stage to make a point. And of course, Billy Graham, who used to pack out huge stadiums at his harvest crusades. I attended one of them when I was a kid, and they're really something. Simple gospel message of salvation in Jesus Christ and the call to come forward and accept that salvation, confess your sins and be saved. A tradition that goes all the way back to that Second Great Awakening. But you see what's happened here. The informalism prevails and it becomes the dominant thing. And what's strange is, these are sort of outside the church. These are popular revival meetings, but today you see churches that have it inside. The dislike for formalism is, you might even say, the form itself in what are often called evangelical megachurches. It's very individual, it's very self-expressive. It caters very much to your popular tastes and what you want and what you crave in your personal spirituality. There's no liturgy here, right? There's no predictable way that anything goes, except for like the sermon and the music. And actually, it's the music and the sermon usually, but that's it. It's informal. Americans don't like forms. And Tocqueville says this is a little dangerous because forms are good. They transmit knowledge to you about transcendent things that are very important. You're going to lose that experience if you make it all about this very informal way. So, it's okay, he says on page 184, to adapt to fit the times, but that's completely different from altering the inside of what you are to fit the times. And saying that, he sounds very much like Thomas Aquinas if you read the treatise on law. But yeah, consider this in light of recent trends. What is the biggest group of religious group in the United States? It's the non-religious. It's the unaffiliated, or sorry, growing, I should say. The fastest growing group is the non-affiliated, or what are often called the nons, N-O-N-E-S, right? The ones who say they just have no affiliation. Evangelical Protestants are still the dominant thing, though between 2007 and 2014 they decline. You see the Catholic Church decline from 23.9 to 20%. Although, remember, the Catholic Church is quite a bit bigger and more homogenous. Plus, they have high replacement rate. So for every Catholic who walks away from the church, a Catholic family has 10 kids. Right? So they have a way of sustaining themselves like that. Mainline Protestants, though, very formal, but they're declining fast, right? So there you have it. The preference for informalism really is the dominant thing. But yeah, among Christians, though, it's again, the evangelical Protestants have the greatest numbers, even though they're not a formal organization. They don't have like a central hub. There's no like bishop of the evangelical church or anything like that. They're just spontaneous, independent, largely mega churches. And that's the preference. Catholics come in a close second, and then mainline Protestants declining pretty fast, like we said a minute ago. Unaffiliated, though, on the rise. What does this mean for the future of religion? Maybe we should recover the value of formalism. Can evangelicals learn to appreciate it? There's also, he says, the lingering tendency to look to material comfort. And I guess this kind of fits together with informalism. We look at spirituality very much through the lens of material prosperity and spiritual need. A couple examples of that. I used to drive by just about every day Saddleback Church in Orange County, California. It's kind of like the flagship megachurch in the United States. There are quite a few of these. There's like thousands of people in attendance. But I found out that they consulted with Disneyland architects and designers to design their campus. What does that tell you? Church should feel like a theme park, that it should cater very much to your material needs and your material tastes. And so as a result, it's a fine line between this being a church and a shopping center. And there's a hip coffee shop and a huge saltwater aquarium. And what is happening here? Now, to their credit, I know full well that people who found and operate these congregations, they really are what they call seeker sensitive. They want to bring people in. If that means, amp up the materialism so that they come in at least and hear the gospel and then maybe turn their minds to God, okay, that makes sense. But it's a dangerous thing, though, isn't it? Tocqueville says. What happens when the materialism completely overtakes the spirituality and we lose our sense of transcendence? The principal business of religion, he says in 184 toward the bottom, is to purify, regulate, and restrain the too ardent and too exclusive taste for well-being that men experience in times of equality. And yet, if it just gives in to that desire for well-being, what's it doing? Last of all, I mean, you can kind of put all these into one category. All of this is, once again, the power of popular opinion to emphasize personal inspiration, to overtake transcendence, and translate religion much more into social needs and political needs, to scorn formalism, and finally amp up the materialism. All of that falls under same old problem of tyranny of the majority. And so, yeah, democracy on one hand needs religion to do certain things for it, like he said a few chapters back. But at the same time, democracy is dangerous to religion. Why is that? He reflects on the American clergy again. Like he said previously, they don't get involved in politics. Even when they have close contact with politics, they still remain kind of outside of it. Once in a while, you get a priest, a minister, somebody who gets really, really political in one direction or the other, and it makes big headlines. But the vast majority of them just don't do that. So, even the case of Billy Graham, right? Who's starting with Dwight Eisenhower, met with every single American president, right up until Barack Obama. Graham lived to be 90 something and passed away. But even then, his meetings, his statements never really took a partisan position. I think he slipped here and there, but for the most part, no. It was just a basic gospel message, just a private chat with the president, a few recommendations, and a photo op, and that would be about it. He met with presidents of both parties, right? He was very apolitical despite his close contact with American presidents. So, what about, though, chapter 6 on page 186, American Catholicism, which he's touched on before? But here he said has a whole different twist. Not only are Americans exceptionally, or not only Catholics exceptionally good Americans, but more than that, they have an advantage in American democracy, that there's sort of an avenue for the progress of Catholicism in the United States. That's an astonishing claim if you read that in 1835 and go, what? How is Catholicism going to grow here? I mean, yeah, you hear about a weirdo who converts from Protestantism to Catholicism here and there, but it's not going to have droves of converts. Tocqueville says, but think again. What does Catholicism do that democracy actually needs? He's touched on this before, but he's thinking about it again here. We live in an era where men are naturally little disposed to believe. On page 186, the dangers that loom over Christianity in democratic times are great. And he says Protestantism's doing great, but it's not really prepared for the onslaught of culture shift that he sees coming, and the things that could extinguish Christian faith entirely. Catholicism, though, is built to last. It endures. It's got a tradition that doesn't budge. And isn't that exactly what democratic times need, where everything is in flux and everything's kind of up in the air and unpredictable? Don't you want to plant your feet someplace solid, Tocqueville says? Yeah, men are little disposed to believe in democratic times, but as soon as they have a religion, they immediately come up with a hidden instinct in themselves that pushes them without knowing it toward Catholicism. Several of the doctrines and practices of the Roman Church astonish them, right? I mean, it's pretty strange if you're not used to it coming from outside, but they feel a secret admiration for its government, its unit, and its unity attracts them. You got to admit, right? Even if you're not Catholic at all, and yet you go to mass and you realize this is the way the mass has always been done. I mean, it's been changed here and there through the centuries, but its general structure and purpose is very, very much the same across the centuries. Don't you crave that kind of solid, fixed nature of things, or do you just want it all changing? Do you want your faith to just be a product of everything else and up to you? Or do you want it to be something true and outside of yourself? 187. One of the most usual weaknesses of the human mind is to want to reconcile opposite principles and to purchase peace at the expense of logic. Thus, there have always been and there always will be men who, after having subjected some of their religious beliefs to an authority, will want to withdraw from it certain others and allow their minds to float haphazardly between obedience and liberty. However, he says, I am led to believe that their number will be less in democratic times. They're going to get tired, right, of just making up their own beliefs or reducing whatever beliefs they have to themselves as individuals. I mean, how satisfying is it to say, I'm into photography, skinny jeans, and Christianity. It's all about me, right? Something about that is unsatisfying. Tocqueville says, yeah, it's going to burn out. And so as a result, what will happen? In the future, our descendants will tend more and more to be divided into two parts only. One's abandoning Christianity entirely, and others entering the bosom of the Roman Church. And then he just ends the chapter with no explanation about how he thinks that'll happen or what will happen. Well, there's quite a prediction, but as we can probably tell, it's not one that has come quite true. The world, though, he says, will be divided between Catholicism and non-religion someday, and all true believing Christians will find their way back to Rome. And you have seen things like this here and there. Catholics and evangelicals together, the statement in First Things magazine, growing ecumenicalism, not between formal Protestants and Catholics, but between evangelicals and Catholics. You go to the March for Life and you're walking along, and over there are the evangelicals. You're praying your rosary, and over there are the guys with the guitars, like singing worship songs, marching together. Certain social causes are uniting uh, uh, Protestants and Catholics more and more, evangelicals specifically. Meanwhile, like we said, the rise of the nones going up and up and up. This is only since 2010. There's even more now of people who just don't affiliate with anything religious. So maybe Tocqueville's prediction hasn't become exactly true, at least not yet, but it seems possible that you're going to see more and more Christian unity than we've seen since the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation than we've ever seen before. So we'll see and leave it to God. One great danger, though, that democratic thinking causes, he says in the following chapter, chapter 8, is the way that we tend to put trust in what he calls human perfectibility. Perfectibility meaning changeability, meaning that we don't have to be totally beholden to the laws of economics or society, politics, or for that matter, gravity. Maybe anything is possible. I mean, hey, who could have believed, 300 years ago that we'd have airplanes? And yet here we are. It seems like we do this all the time, right? We advance and we progress and we rise above our circumstances. And that's always been a sort of human tendency, but Tocqueville says that's really a powerful democratic tendency. Didn't make any sense in old aristocratic times where everybody knew their place in that three-layered cake of society, right? Nobles, church, serfs. But now that we're all equal, or more equal than we've ever been, possibilities seem limitless. You've seen this before, right? You've heard it before. What's every kindergarten kid told? Believe in yourself and you can achieve anything, right? The future is always brighter. There's always an onward and upward slope to human experience. We don't have to be bound down. Or how did Barack Obama put it? The arc of history bends toward justice or whatever. We just don't have to accept the rules. This is a very American way of thinking. I think of its most benign expression in Disney movies, right? It's always that rising above. You always know better than everyone else. And so there you go. What's funny is there are always adaptations of older stories like Grimm's fairy tales where things don't end that way. They don't live happily ever after, but not in America. We've got to live happily ever after, right? That just goes without saying. It gets a little more troubling, though, when you start to talk about biotechnology and the possibilities of altering ourselves and our biology and our composition, or the popular phrase, designer babies. I've heard that before. I mean, look, if you can pre-select embryos, right, and choose the ones that have the eye color and the hair color that you want, or for that matter, perfect pitch and perfect athletic ability, and why wouldn't you? I mean, it's up to parents, right? It's up to you in your own individual life to find your own way. Maybe we are perfectible. This is a very troubling proposition that Tocqueville proposes here. And he sees this kind of thing coming early, early on in American life. What puts the brakes on it? What stops it? Well, he doesn't mention it here, but he mentioned it before. Once again, it's religion, which is fine with progress, so long as progress is done in the name of human dignity, not, cloning and not, manipulation of that human dignity to serve some other end in technology that's not actually good for us. Check your perfectibility, right? Lastly, he discusses science in America, fits together with the perfectibility chapter. Who were the great scientific minds of the old world, and what did they do? They were all about discovery. Scientific discoveries were the goal. The expansion of the human mind to take in new, or not necessarily new, but more true knowledge than what it had before, to challenge the existing ideas like Galileo, right, in order to grasp a firmer reality. And all the while, that practically all of them would agree that no matter what discoveries you made, they would show more and more of the glory of God. There was no doubt about that in their minds. But still, it was discovery, it was knowledge. What's different in America, very much like philosophic ideas, we see it as a matter of technology and invention. What's the point of knowing something unless you know how to use it? So, too, who are the geniuses of our time? Great discoverers? No, great inventors, right? Bill Gates, Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, steel tycoon, right? Those are the geniuses of our time. Those are the people who we look to, not those who make great discoveries, but those who build better machines. So, what does this mean for scientific knowledge? We're all about STEM these days, right? You see the T-shirts all over the place, and it's a very good, field to go into. But still, no matter how much scientific knowledge you gain, Americans tend to assume that the whole point of that knowledge is to apply it in some way, right? We got to use it. What's the point of knowing if you don't use that knowledge directly? That was that elementary school poster. Knowledge is power, right? Not knowledge is good for its own sake. Who thinks that anymore? No, knowledge is power. Knowledge is skill and technique. Technology is the end goal here. You're gonna wonder, like, what would Galileo or Newton or Kepler think of that? That's kind of vulgar. In fact, he uses an example. Unfortunately, this edition left it out. But who was Archimedes, the ancient Greek inventor in Syracuse? He built magnificent machines. And even some of them were weapons of war that were apparently quite effective, if ancient historians can be trusted, channeling the sun with a whole bunch of curved mirrors that would make them combust, make ships combust out on the sea. And Archimedes famously burned all of his plans. Why? Because weapons of war are so monstrous and terrible? No, because machines are not as dignified as scientific knowledge, right? He was ashamed that he had built these things because they didn't have to do with discovery, which is so much superior to machines and contraptions. Or uh, contrast that with modern times. Who do we see as the great inventors in our time? You saw the Oppenheimer movie. What seemed to be the point of physics, nuclear physics, if it weren't for the sake of applying it to a bomb? And so Oppenheimer did in the Manhattan Project and allowed the United States to use the first nuclear weapons against Japan at the end of World War II. It ushered in a whole new age of nuclear power that is really, really formative of international relations and politics today. Now, to his credit, Oppenheimer felt a great deal of shame at what he had done. But for him, it had not so much to do with the use of the technology as what happened to the Japanese. You see in the movie, right, where Harry Truman tries to reassure him, look, I gave the order as president. You're just the scientist who made the weapon. So chill out, right? But that was it. It had nothing to do with applying nuclear physics knowledge to the technology for him. But that's the age we're in. And all Tocqueville can really say is what? How do we check this danger and this tendency? Americans, learn to love knowledge for its own sake. Learn to value discovery and insight and expansion of the mind, and not just machines and contraptions and weapons. When we come back, let's transition to a bit of, and there's an American philosophic method and a bit on science, but let's transition then to American psychology and the way that we tend to understand ourselves in a more emotional way. What are the dynamics of democratic passions and emotions, and especially when it comes to that all-pervasive tendency toward individualism? He'll have a lot to say about that. So, see you next time.